are recording now. Mark, welcome back. What are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about backlog refinement.
Backlog refinement and all the pitfalls that entails, right? And what was cool is like before we kind of like get started with this meeting, we're gonna dive into our normal format of like going like pitfall by pitfall, the things that we thought most important. But you said, hey, we should probably take a step back and just talk about the context of this meeting and this activity and how it's different than the other Scrum events that go on. So maybe you can start there.
Yeah, sure. So like the other Scrum events that we've covered kind of have a well understood format. There's like a script to follow. You have daily stand up that happens every day. You've got your planning and your retrospective. Those obviously happen on a sprint cadence. With refinement, it's a little bit broader and it's not as prescriptive. Sure, there are some people that will tell you certain rules, like you should have X number of sprints worth of work done. Uh, but the reality is refinement is kind of nebulous in that it's all of the activities that are required so that planning is successful. Like there's a lot of context setting, there's a lot of technical discussion, and the degree to which you break that down is going to vary by team and situation.
It's funny you mention that because as I was even prepping for this, and I was like, once again, this always happens. I don't know why, which is like, oh, refinement, pretty straightforward, not really much to talk about. And then as I started pulling on it, I'm like, oh my God, there's like so much that goes into it. And you're right. There's so many activities that happen even outside the team itself that need to be set up correctly
Yep.
before a team can be successful in, that refinement meeting. Um, so yeah, what type of activities need to happen? Like what is context and what are some of the things that might throw a team off when those aren't done well?
Yeah, again, it's going to vary by team, but it's that sufficient level of knowledge of the environment that you're in, both company and the technical environment. Um, it really is a lot of conversations that have to happen ahead of time. And the barometer of success, again, for refinement itself is, can you have successful planning? Like, can a team get to work? Like, so it's like anything that could be a barrier to the team having that successful planning meeting itself and just like kicking off the sprint from the get-go. Those are things that have to be taken into consideration to refinement. And to like you said, there's the refinement meeting itself, and then there's activities that happen outside of a meeting, right? There's a lot of activity that has to happen so that the team understands the work that they're being asked to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that notion. I mean, it's kind of like that definition of ready, which is like, can you start planning? And it's a great litmus test, right? Like, can you pick up this work and look at it and then go into planning and then even better, like actually pick it up in the sprint and start working on it, right? And it seems like a simple question, but you're right. There's so much that goes into it. It's really, really hard. And I mean, in a way, I'll have to check my knowledge of the Scrum guide here really quick, which is like, is it even a meeting? I don't even think it's technically an event. It's not an event in Scrum, right?
Right.
It's an activity that
Yep.
happens, right? And I don't have to read the Scrum guide, the newest Scrum guide again. So this is mid-January 2021, and the new Scrum guide came out just last November in 2020. And I'll have to check again to see what their guidelines are for refinement. But last I remember, it was you should not spend more than 10% of your sprint activities on refinement. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you think about it, if you're doing 2 week sprints, that's 10 working days in those 2 weeks, 10 working days, 10% of 10 is 1 day.
Yeah.
So imagine that you like per Scrum, the Scrum guide, you could spend up to a full day doing nothing but just refinement. And that would be within the guidelines of the Scrum guide, right? So it's a lot. It's a lot of time and activity. It's not just the meeting itself.
Yeah, and it's going to depend. It's going to depend on how mature the team is. Like how well the team knows itself. How well does the team know the work? Because, like I said earlier, my preference is to not actually dictate a certain rule because it really should be anything that's required to get you to that state of that successful planning. So like if you're a brand new team, like especially like brand new team members new to a company type of situation, like that's going to require a lot of context building and a lot of refinement. So, and not to go back to that whole sprint zero debate, but it really is that nebulous amount of activity that's required to be successful. Like a mature team, sure, if you've built up a cadence and have a sustained velocity and have demonstrated success, you probably are going to need a lot less of that specific refinement activity because you've already kind of established that that context and that ability to know what is needed to get the work done, to the point where you're having straightforward and easy conversations about the work. When it's new, it's just going to be a more intensive process.
Yeah, and what's perfect is like we are kind of in that situation a little bit, like we with our teams that we have here at the Standard. You know, we've been here like what, 7 months now, 8 months now, and for the beginning months, it was just all of that context building and just like in a way, it's like very little development and just like all refinements.
Right.
We didn't call it, you know, team refinement meeting. It was just like meeting after meeting after meeting on setting context on the product, like strategy, direction, technical strategy and direction. Just a lot of discussions on that. So I think that's a good point, which is there's kind of like this relationship between the more complexity and uncertainty you're dealing with, the more you need refinement.
Exactly.
Right? And then the less complexity, the less ambiguity, the less you need refinement. I mean, the more mature teams that I've been with, yeah, you're right. Like, you know, we would have like a 1 hour refinement meeting per sprint. And sometimes you get done in like 30 minutes. It's like, oh, guys, yeah, remember that? All right, cool. So and so's going to work on that, da 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 da, and then you're out, right? Other teams, it's like, it's almost like you can't do enough,
Right.
right? That whole like 10% notion that I just talked about, you almost like take that and like laugh at it. You're like, 10%, come on. It's like, we need to spend like all week on this. And so, yeah, it just kind of depends on the team, like everything in Scrum.
Right.
But there is that relationship there. Okay, cool. Is that enough context setting, Mark? Anything else you want to like talk about as far as like what makes this activity slash event different than other Scrum events that we talk about?
No, I think we've covered why it's different. I think let's dig into some of the specifics about how to make this successful and where are the pitfalls.
Yeah, and we already kind of touched on it a little bit, but the number one is like the number one pitfall that we identified is just work not even being ready to refine,
Yeah.
right? So there's the notion of definition of ready, which is like, okay, can we even pick this up in a sprint? But there's also kind of like this notion even before that, which is like, is this even ready to bring to the team, right?
Right.
Do I want to have the team spend time and energy looking at this material, right? And so, Mark, I'm sure you can relate to this too, which is you get to refinement, team sits down, pulls up the first item, it says something kind of generic for a title, update database with new variable. And then you open it up and there's just like literally nothing. And you're like,
Right.
okay. And then the conversation just starts very cold. It's like, well, what do you mean? What's the purpose of this? Why are we doing it? What's the variable name? What table are you going to update this in? Blah, blah, blah. Just the conversation just explodes, right? What are the things have you noticed when like work isn't ready?
Well, no, and that's an interesting point too, because somewhere way back, someone told me that the idea of a story was it was just supposed to represent a conversation. So that's like the beginning of the refinement process is, can you bring an item to the team, and is it ready for discussion? Like, that's the real question, I think. Is it are we ready to discuss this as a team? Because you could show up with a blank item, and if everybody knows what they need to know and can have a productive conversation, you can kind of then you're in refinement. You're just doing it on the fly, and you're doing that. So yeah, so as far as like when you're not able to do that, then you're back to talking about, well, you're not even ready to have the meeting itself. There are other activities, whether it's reviewing documentation, doing overview of the product itself, whatever that might be, so that the team can even start that productive conversation.
Oh man, I feel like Mark, you're schooling me right now. That's a great way to put it, which is like, it's not really about the level of detail in the card. That's kind of dependent on the team and the context and whatever you're working on. It's more about like, can we even have the conversation? Can we even have a productive conversation about this work? And so that just depends. It just
Right.
depends on where you're at. So that's a really, really good point. Um, yeah. And so one of the things I thought about for this pitfall is like making that lack of pre-refinement readiness, whatever you want to call that, transparent. And
Yeah.
so things that I've done in the past is to set up like a filter in Jira or just doing some like just pre-labeling of work that like needs to get like tagging. There's a statuses in Jira you can change that says, hey, this needs refinement or it needs to be further talked about before we can even pick it up. So it's like making things transparent to that issue of like, is this even ready to be brought into refinement? I think can be like a workaround to this. Anything else you
Yeah,
can
to
think
your
of?
point, the goal you're kind of driving to is, we talked about how we want the team to be ready for that iteration planning, but like an output of a refinement session, really should be, hopefully a team has established a definition of ready, like you mentioned, right?
Mm.
And that's going to vary by team, but those are the indicators of, can we build toward that definition of ready, whatever that might be, as far as to the level of detail that the team needs, as far as like acceptance criteria, um, stuff like BDD. That's all going to depend, and that's what the team needs to start answering. Like, if you propose an agenda, hey, are we ready to talk about this? The team needs to have that understanding of what's the output that we're driving to. What is ready for us?
Yep, exactly. And that kind of reminds me of something that my current PO does, which I absolutely love, is create like a Confluence page with kind of like her thoughts on the refinement agenda. So it's just like it's a prioritized list of questions, items, specific Jira issues to talk about that set the context for the actual refinement meeting itself. So people aren't going in cold and just saying, "Oh, hey, what are we working on?" It's like, "Oh, no. Like, here's the plan," and then she'll tag people, or she'll direct them and stand up and say, "Hey, make sure you look at that. Make sure you look at this item beforehand. Maybe add some details to it before the refinement meeting, so we can have that productive conversation." So that I found super helpful, and I absolutely love it.
I think that's a great practice. And it helps to reinforce with the team that refinement itself is a team-owned activity.
Oh
Like one of the goals is to make sure every single team member is on the same page, that you're building that alignment, you're eliminating any sort of ambiguity or confusion that might be related to the items that you're discussing.
yeah, exactly. I think one of the last things I kind of want to say about this, like, not readiness. We talked about transparency to like the not readiness in order to know like what the state is of your refinement, so you can be better prepared, is to kind of like a lot of things in Scrum and the work we do is to kind of like look back on how things are going and then adjusting how much refinement and
Totally.
what type of environment what you're doing. So like, like a lot of we do, we try stuff and then we run the experiment and then see how it goes. So it's not unusual for like to run the team with their current process. And if things aren't feeling like they're ready in refinement, you're having those kind of like big context setting conversations in the refinement meeting, or there's just like showstoppers, like, well, we can't talk about this until so and so makes a decision. Um, Using that as a gauge on how much refinement you need. So when you start having more of those kind of like false start refinements, it's like, all right, we need to amp up our refinement activities. And so setting up more refinement with the team, setting up outside conversations with specific stakeholders on a regular occurrence can be, something that you do as well. Just checking in with dependent teams to make sure that they're aligned to what you're doing. So just like little things like that. And then as those other activities kind of become overkill, where like, it's like, oh man, why do we have this meeting again? Like, once that kind of becomes overkill, it's like, all right, time to tone them down and start pulling back all those activities and seeing like kind of how much you can get away with. You don't want to pull back too much because maybe those activities kind of led you to be successful in the first place. So there's the balance there. But I always try to look back on how the team is doing to know how much refinement should we be having here.
I love that idea. I think it's great to keep a good pulse on how that's working. And this just goes back to our original context setting of, this particular activity is less defined, less prescriptive than the other ones. So you really do need to keep engaged with how is it working for the team and keep it dialed into where it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly. All right, next up, that the pitfall that we've identified is no PO. And breaks my heart when I run into this situation. And I thought about like, there's so many different ways that this could play out. Like, why don't you have a PO in your refinement? There's like, it could be the PO wants to show up, but they're just too busy. That's one situation. It could be the PO just doesn't really believe in refinement and thinks it's more of like the team's responsibility to do that, right? And so there's that kind of situation. There's also another situation where it's like your team just doesn't have a PO, and that could be a whole different conversation, right? So there's many different ways that this plays out as far as like no PO. So maybe we can start with the PO wants to show up, but just doesn't have the time to do it, right? So in those situations, Mark, I'm sure you've run into that in the past. It's a very common problem. POs are very
Sure.
busy.
Yeah. To not have
Very
fully
busy.
dedicated product owners. Yes. That is
Yeah,
common to encounter.
yeah. So what have you done in the past?
Yeah. The best way to handle that is, one, If the product owner can't be there for the meetings, like if that's a trend that continues, you're not going to be very successful. So one-offs are okay, and to kind of set the team up for success there, it really does need to be either you're asynchronously getting some level setting between the product owner and the team, but for sure you are ensuring that the product owner has done prioritization as a first pass, that the team is able to discuss the right kind of work, and to whatever extent the context setting, the team is at that point where they can have a productive conversation about the work itself. So maybe they've had prior conversations, maybe higher level as far as the what, because the product owner owns the what that's being delivered, and then the team owns the how. So as long as the what is understood, you can have a successful refinement without a product owner. But again, the refinement session itself is best when it's led by the product owner, because they are the ones who are setting the vision for the product, and that's just going to lead to the best, most productive conversations.
Yeah, and that's kind of like a tangent to something that I feel like is maybe a slight misunderstanding of the role of a Scrum Master in refinement. I see a lot of teams kind of like still lean heavily on the Scrum Master to drive and facilitate and like lead the charge when it comes to refinement. But man, I tell you what, it really comes down to the PO to kind of take the lead in the charge, because it's all about preparing the backlog, which is the artifact that encapsulates the PO's vision for the product. This isn't my vision. It's not your vision. It's like their vision. They're driving the team towards producing a highly valuable product that's going to like delight our customers. It's all about them, right? So I think they should be the ones largely leading that and making it happen. Now, as far as like the PO not being there, yeah, it's like I think that asynchronous can be helpful as far as like setting the context for the what, emails, maybe a video recording, helping them set the context of what's even going on. And I think once again, it like kind of goes back to that like trade-off of like complexity versus ambiguity. And like the more complex and ambiguity you have, the more the PO needs to be involved. Like if it's not very complex, the PO can just maybe send an email, like setting the context for the team, and then the team can dive in, right? But it really, really depends. Interesting. Cool. So there's the instance where the PO is kind of wanting to be there, but doesn't really have time. What about that PO who's like, listen, it's like, I don't really believe in this whole agile thing, whatever. What do you do in that case where they're just not really bought into the process?
Well, that's going to be problematic, because again, for the team to be successful, you need a couple things in place. You need priority order so the team knows what to take on. Like if you're not going to have an engaged product owner, okay, then what you're trying to emulate is kind of a pull system where the team can kind of operate on its own, right? But I don't think you're going to get very far with an unengaged or disengaged product owner. Like, so you're going to have to find ways to pull them in, because again, the team can't own the what. Someone has to own the what and be that liaison, that representative of the end user and the customer, that one who's identifying the value that's being delivered. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. There's no silver bullet answer here, which is it's a very common technique that I use anyways as a Scrum Master, which is making the pain visible, right? And just
100%.
it's like I don't have that PO who really believes in the process. Maybe I can sell them on the importance of them being there, and that having that person there own the what. So it's just like making the pain as visible as possible to that person, tactfully, of course. I don't want to say, here's how you're not doing your job. It's more just like, hey, the team really needs you. We're having trouble doing X, Y, Z. It's really leading to some just like uncertainty and impact on our day-to-day development. Like, it would be great if you could be there for us and help set that context. Just be that tiebreaker too, or just make the call to help set that direction. So I would probably first start making the pain visible to them and seeing if I can get some buy-in there. But if they're really digging in their heels for whatever reason, some people don't want to be a PO. It's totally fine. Making the pain visible to the larger organization, right? So my manager, maybe a dev manager or a PO, someone who can kind of maybe influence the situation to rectify the fact that like either maybe do some high level coaching to that person, or maybe find a person who is a little more engaged to be a PO. So you don't want to start there. You don't want to start heavy and hot. You kind of want to work your way up there. And once again, always being tactful about that pain. Just making things visible at the team level just as visible as possible to the higher ups and just the things that they're going through.
I think that's a great call. And one we should remember for a lot of situations in an agile environment. And one thing that helps in that regard is make sure you have that established definition of ready with the team, because one thing that a dynamic you want to instill, even when things are going well, when it's healthy, you want the team to say yes or no. Are they ready to take on the work, right? Does it meet our definition? Will we be successful? That's one of the tools you can use to kind of help make that visible. If the team stops taking on work because they're saying the work isn't ready, that's a clear signal up the chain that, hey, we need to fix this.
Yep, totally. And then to maybe tie up this last pitfall, or this pitfall that we're on right now, in those situations where you don't have a PO, well, I've been in that situation and it doesn't go well. Let me tell you, right? There's a reason the Scrum Guide provides this specific role. Very, very important. In that case, once again, I kind of just made that pain visible, what the team was going through, to the managers and larger organizations. And it took a long time to get that situation resolved, but it did. But yeah, just continuing to make that pain visible in a tactful way, just over and over again. You don't want to bring it up every day, maybe not even every week, but just like, every sprint, every month, like, oh, by the way, team's not doing well, no PO. So what are we doing about this? Like, hey, when are we gonna get a PO? That type of stuff. But yeah, not having that PO is huge detriment to having work ready to go for the team so they can be successful. All right, Mark, this is officially our longest video. Clocking in at like 22 minutes around thereabouts. I think we can leave it there for now, unless you have any last thoughts, questions, or comments, anything.
Yeah, one last area to touch on. So we just talked about what happens when the what isn't working well for the team. You can run into problems if the team isn't solid on the how, whether that's not having solid architectural or tech lead participation in the process. So that's just another area to watch out for. And again, a fix there is have a good definition of ready. Watch out for the team getting too technical, because when it comes to successful refinement, it really is about what is being delivered and how can be done separately, especially if you're bringing in business stakeholders to the conversation. You want to keep those streamlined to the what, because that's the building block of that all the rest of this is based on. You have to have a solid foundation of what the what is, and then you can kind of get into the weeds of the how.
Kind of. I like once I put a little asterisk to that comment, which is sometimes the what needs to be informed by the how, right? So if the product owner wants, like, I want self-driving cars that fly, it's like, oh, by the way, that's kind of like impossible right now. Come back in like 100 years when we can do that. So sometimes there's that feedback loop between the what and the how that really informs the what. But yeah, I mean, like I said, this topic is just huge.
Sure.
I really underestimated how much you can talk about this. So right there, Mark, we could pull on that string for another like 20 minutes. But we'll leave it at that. Thanks everyone for stopping by and watching. Once again, hit us up if you want to talk more about this or have any other comments on what we talked about.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, see you.